the whole British nation would be on the front line during the Second World War. A siege mentality was created in an island nation. British doggedness would endure and overcome tyranny. On the 2nd of September 1939, under intense pressure in the House of Commons, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain abandoned his plans to offer to negotiate peace terms between Germany and Poland. Instead, with the British Armed Forces already mobilised the previous day, he was forced to issue an ultimatum to Hitler. The next day, war was declared. Just 1 week later, an official broadcast in Paris announced that British troops were engaged in an offensive operation against German forces. An hour or so later, a second French radio broadcast substantiated this report. Within minutes, American journalists had cabled the story to the United States, and soon it had been spread worldwide by the United Press and Reuters press agencies. This created a problem for the British government, which had placed a news blackout through a D-notice on all information about the deployment of the British Expeditionary Force, which had already started to depart to France. Consequently, British journalists were instantly curious about what was really going on, and some fairly speculative stories started to appear in the press. Of course, the story broadcast in France was completely untrue. But before a shot had actually been fired in anger by any British soldier in the war, British wartime censorship had already been shredded. The new Ministry of Information, only 1 week into its existence, was forced to fight a damage limitation exercise. An editorial in the Daily Mail attacked muddle-headed bureaucrats and accused the government of acting in a true Gestapo fashion. A parliamentary debate poured scorn on the ministry, which had very quickly come face to face with the complications of running censorship in an open society. Lord Reith, the former Director General of the BBC, and then the Conservative Member of Parliament Duff Cooper, were appointed in succession as Ministers of Information in an attempt to stabilise the situation. However, it was not until the appointment in early 1941 of Brendan Bracken, the Conservative MP for Paddington and Arch Churchill supporter, that the government and the British Free Press found a way to coexist in the national interest. By this time, the Ministry of Information had become primarily the propaganda arm of the British government, issuing posters that encouraged the civilian population, offering information, and even celebrating Britain and its countryside through famous posters created by Frank Newbold. Another organisation that had to reinvent itself at the outbreak of the war was the BBC. It now more than doubled in size, and it adopted a new culture and outlook. Its infant television service was immediately closed down, but radio became more popular than ever. The BBC expanded its overseas language service, while at home they created a new channel called the Home Service by amalgamating the national programme with much of its regional output.
Royal Air Force machines flew over northern and western Germany last night and dropped more than 6 million leaflets addressed to the German people. The Ministry of Information says that they carried out extensive reconnaissance flights and that they were not engaged by any hostile aircraft.
But the dreary Home Service immediately proved to be rather dry and indigestible for most listeners, and so, a few months later, a lighter and more entertaining channel was introduced, called the Forces Programme.
I thought I was coming home on leave this week, but Lord Gort thought different.
In general, the BBC during the war would learn to communicate better with its listeners, rather than, as had been the tendency before the war, to speak at them. The BBC's role was initially enhanced by being a conduit through which information was delivered to the British people.
The evacuation of British children is going on smoothly and efficiently. The Ministry of Health says that great progress has been made with the first part of the government's arrangements. Railways, the road transport organizations, the local authorities and teachers, the voluntary workers, and not least, the householders in the reception areas are all playing their parts splendidly.
Behind the scenes, the BBC was also tasked with providing a monitoring service of overseas propaganda broadcasts. But for the first 6 months of the war, the BBC had little to report. The population was more affected by the call-up, the issue of identity cards, and the introduction of rationing. Fuel was the first commodity to be rationed, just a week after the declaration of war. Some cars and trucks were converted to gas, which was contained in large bags, normally on the route. But they lacked power and only had a range of about 50 miles with a full bag. It was during these early months of the war, when the British people were coming to terms with separation, that a poignant record was released by a relatively unknown artist called Vera Lynn. We'll Meet Again was to become the most popular song of the war, but this, the original recording, was done on a sparse budget.
Let's say goodbye with a smile, dear, just for a while, dear, we must part. Don't let this parting upset you, I'll not forget you, sweetheart. We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day.
Soon afterwards, Vera Lynn topped the poll in the Daily Express as the favourite singer of British troops in France, beating Bing Crosby into second place and hence gaining the nickname the Force's Sweetheart.
Till the blue skies chase those dark clouds far away.
With so little action, many children who had been evacuated from inner city areas just before the war had actually started began to drift home. By the end of the year, 35% of children in London had returned home. The Ministry of Information attempted to discourage them with a poster campaign. By January 1940, with U-boats attacking British shipping in the Atlantic, the government became fearful about food supplies. 60% of all food consumed in the UK at the time was imported, including 80% of all fruit and 70% of all cereals and fat. That month, food rationing began on bacon, butter and sugar, and soon afterwards it was extended to meat, tea, jam, biscuits, breakfast cereals, cheese, eggs, lard, milk, and canned and dried fruit. The rationing of clothes would follow in June 1941. This is the weekly wartime ration for 2 people, for butter, milk, bacon, lard, sugar, cheese, tea, jam, and meat. To obtain these items, families had to register with a local retailer who would, with each purchase, cross off the coupons in the purchaser's ration card. Effectively by now, the government controlled both the quantity and the price of consumables. Certain foods became completely unavailable during the war, with some shopkeepers displaying the title of a famous song.
We have no bananas. We have no bananas today. We've got string beans and onions and...
In May 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in place of Neville Chamberlain. The whole pace of government increased. Days later, with the war in France going badly, Anthony Eden, the Secretary of State for War, broadcast on the BBC about establishing a new force for the protection of the United Kingdom.
I want to speak to you tonight about the form of warfare which the Germans have been employing so extensively against Holland and Belgium, namely the dropping of troops by parachute behind the main defensive line. Since the war began, the government have received countless inquiries from all over the kingdom, from men of all ages who are for one reason or another not at present engaged in military service, and who wish to do something for the defense of their country. Well, now is your opportunity. We want large numbers of such men in Great Britain who are British subjects between the ages of 17 and 65 to come forward now and offer their service in order to make assurance doubly sure. The name of the new force, which is now to be raised, will be the Local Defence Volunteers.
The Local Defence Volunteers would quickly become better known as the Home Guard. Its establishment started to bring home to people the reality of war, and this was further cemented with the British Army's withdrawal from Dunkirk. Also, for the first time ever, the home population was hearing war reports on the radio from men at the front line, like the BBC's reporter Richard Dimbleby.
For days and nights, ships of all kinds have plied to and fro across the Channel under the fierce onslaught of the enemy's bombers, utterly regardless of the perils, to bring out as many as possible of the trapped VEF.
By this stage, all places of entertainment which had been shut on the outbreak of war had now been allowed to reopen. Entertainment would become a vital element in maintaining the morale of the nation. The Criterion Theatre in London, with its largely underground location, became famous for remaining open even during air raids. It was frequently used by the BBC as a base for broadcasting live programmes. One such show was called Starlight, where the show featured a singer in an intimate setting.
I haven't said thanks for that lovely weekend. Those 2 days of heaven you helped me to spend. The thrill of your kiss.
It was Vera Lynn who became increasingly in demand from the public on this show.
The smile in your eyes like the sun after rain.
By the autumn, the Battle of Britain had given way to Germany's strategic bombing of Britain. The British press soon gave this campaign the nickname the Blitz, shortening another nickname which had been given to Germany's hitherto successful military strategy, Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war. Essentially, the campaign involved the nightly bombing of urban areas, with an emphasis on London and other port cities, including Liverpool, Bristol, Cardiff, Portsmouth, Plymouth, Southampton, Swansea, Belfast and Glasgow. Industrial areas were also targeted, especially in Birmingham, Coventry, Manchester and Sheffield. On the night of the 14th of November 1940, Coventry was hit by a raid of 515 German bombers, the largest such raid to date. The aim was to destroy Coventry's factories and industrial infrastructure, which included the manufacture of munitions, vehicles and aeroplane engines. However, the Germans were well aware that this raid would create substantial damage to the city centre and to residential areas. 13 Heinkel HE-111s, modified to carry navigational devices, accurately dropped marker flares on the city at around 7:30 that evening. Following that, the first wave of bombers dropped high-explosive bombs that destroyed much of the city's water supply, electricity network, telephone lines, and the gas mains. Roads were severely cratered, making it difficult for fire engines to reach the fires that had been started. A second wave of bombers dropped more high-explosive bombs, but mainly incendiary bombs containing either magnesium or petroleum. A firestorm was soon created in the city centre, burning and destroying much of Coventry's ancient and historic cathedral. The Blitz was by now becoming the greatest test of British morale, greater than the evacuation from Dunkirk. Between the 7th of September 1940 and the 11th of May 1941, 143,000 British civilians lost their life in the Blitz. 1 in 6 Londoners were made homeless, and across the country over 1 million homes were destroyed. But it failed to break the spirit of the British people. This is sometimes attributed to the many new civil defence roles that have been set up, which gave the population a sense of being able to fight back, rather than just despair. The King and the Queen during this period refused to leave London, and on the 13th of September 1940, even Buckingham Palace was bombed. The Queen later wrote to her mother-in-law, Queen Mary, saying,
"At this moment we heard the unmistakable whir of a German plane. Before anything else could be said, there was the noise of an aircraft diving at great speed, and then the scream of a bomb. It all happened so quickly that we had only time to look foolishly at each other. Then the scream hurtled past us and exploded with a tremendous crash in the quadrangle."
During this period, the Ministry of Food began establishing canteens. They were known as British restaurants and were run by local authorities on a non-profit basis to provide meals for those unable to cook at home, such as the victims of air raids. Other canteens were established for those in need of extra meals, like factory workers and school children. The number of free school meals increased dramatically from about 160,000 before the war to 1.6 million, which was around 40% of all British children. Not all foods were rationed, for example, fish, but the government dramatically increased its price to reduce demand. Fruit and vegetables were never rationed, but were often unavailable or in short supply, especially tomatoes and onions, and of course, fruit shipped from abroad. As a result, that year, 1941, the British Ministry of Food launched a campaign to encourage everyone to grow their own fruit and vegetables in their own gardens, on allotments, and in public parks. The campaign was called Dig for Victory. As part of this campaign, the government wished to promote the growing and consumption of root vegetables that grow more readily in the United Kingdom. Amongst these are potatoes and carrots. The cartoon characters Potato Pete and Dr. Carrot were created by the British Ministry of Food. Their adverts encouraged families to try new recipes using these more plentiful foods instead of those that were less available. For example, carrots were promoted as a sweetener in desserts in the absence of sugar, which was rationed to just 8 ounces per adult per week. One of the ministry's war cookery leaflets was filled with recipes for carrot pudding, carrot cake, carrot marmalade, and carrot flan. This was backed up by a regular daily 5-minute BBC radio programme called The Kitchen Front that gave hints and tips for new recipes. Such was the success of these promotions that the following year, 1942, there was a 100,000-ton surplus of carrots. Meanwhile, the Air Ministry was putting out stories about a man who became known as Cat's Eyes Cunningham. John Cunningham was a night fighter air ace who was responsible for shooting down countless Luftwaffe bombers in the dark of night. In an effort to hide the fact that he had radar on board his Mosquito fighter plane, the Air Ministry attributed his victories to his supposed high consumption of carrots. This led to the widespread belief that carrots are good for night vision. Whether this story ever convinced the Germans is uncertain, but it did persuade thousands of British children to follow his example and eat plenty of carrots. Ironically, this propaganda story was not as daft as at first it might appear, as carrots include a high dose of vitamin A, which is good for eye health. As the Blitz eased in 1941, rationing became increasingly tight, with the U-boats stepping up their campaign in the Atlantic Ocean. Following Germany's defeat of France in June 1940, U-boats could now operate from French bases, giving them quick and easy access into the Atlantic. With an improved torpedo firing mechanism, they now preyed on British merchant ships with spectacular success for the remainder of 1940 and into 1941 in what U-boat crews called the happy times. It was not until March 1941 that Britain started to pull together a strategy to deal with the U-boat threat. the British and the Canadians gradually established an escort system for convoys. Initially, the British covered the east of the North Atlantic and the Canadians the west. But this left an unescorted section in the middle where the U-boats continued to prey. During this period, there was very little good news to cheer the British people. The war seemed to stagger from one disaster to another, none greater than the fall of Singapore on the 8th of February 1942. There were still occasionally air raids in early 1942, known as the Baedeker raids. The name Baedeker derives from a series of German tourist guidebooks, which the Germans used to select the targets for bombing. These targets included smaller towns and cities, usually with a strong cultural heritage, including Norwich, Exeter, Bath, Canterbury, Lincoln and York. Later, King's Lynn, Ipswich, Swansea, Colchester, Poole, Southampton and Weston-super-Mare were all attacked, as well as Birmingham, Middlesbrough, Hull and Sunderland. By the 1st of July 1942, all petrol sales for non-commercial vehicles was abolished. Now 2 years into the war, with little prospect of its end, the increased workload of the population in the factories and manning home guard posts overnight was exhausting the nation. War output in the factories declined, and strenuous efforts were made to keep up spirits. But better news was coming, with on the 15th of November, church bells being rung in celebration of the 8th Army's victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein.
Oh, the factories may be roaring with the boom-a-lacka, zoom-a-lacka-wee, but there isn't any roar when the clock strikes 4, everything stops for tea. Oh, a lawyer in the courtroom in the middle of an alimony plea has to stop and help him for when the clock strikes 4, everything stops for tea.
To encourage workers in maintaining production, the BBC's Home Service ran a twice-daily programme of catchy tunes called Music While You Work. Meanwhile, the BBC had set up shortwave transmissions of their forces programmes in many overseas locations where British servicemen were serving, most notably in the Western Desert. As a result of her popularity on Starlight, the BBC commissioned a weekly show by Vera Lynn called Sincerely Yours, which brought servicemen overseas closer to their families back home.
A letter from home to the forces, from Vera Lynn and Fred Hartley.
Just keep on wishing, and care will go.
To our men in uniform, from the girls at home. A personal letter in words and music, and the signature is
Sincerely yours, Vera Lynn.
With Fred Hartley and his music, presented by Howard Thomas.
This show was an instant success, not only at home, but on every worldwide battleground where the BBC shortwave radio reached. Vera Lynn sent messages to troops far from home, interspersed with her live performances of the songs that became symbolic for the British in the Second World War.
This letter of mine is getting to be a sort of rendezvous, where husbands and wives, torn apart by war, can be brought together by music. On the wings of these melodies, the sentiments go from me to both of you, from you to her. Here is our song together tonight.
she presented it in the form of a letter from her to the servicemen in combat zones.
Dear boys, I've been working in the West End all this week and using the tubes and buses a lot. I realized how well some of the girls are doing your job while you're away.
Throughout its first run, the programme attracted over 2,000 requests per week. It became an invaluable communication for women in Britain who would, for example, write to Vera to announce to their husbands overseas the safe birth of a child.
You'll hear from me again next week. Good night, boys. Sincerely yours, Vera Lynn. We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again.
Every show ended with her singing, "We'll meet again." At home, Rationing ironically produced one of the healthiest generations before or since the war, and infant mortality dropped to just 49 per 1,000 children, the lowest figure ever recorded in Britain at that time. Radio airtime was given to health matters, with regular programmes with the radio doctor, Dr. Charles Hill, later to become the chairman of the BBC.
I cannot eat but little meat, my stomach is not good. No, that's not a confession. It's a poet's description of a pre-war Boxing Day. Really pre-war, for he wrote it 400 years ago. But how are you today? How's your tongue? Is it smooth and red, or knobby and beige with an overcoat of a muddy hue? And how's the stomach? Is it firm and steady, or somewhat warm, or a little wobbly and a trifle windy? Or was your Christmas Day so Spartan that today you're fighting fit with no twinge of remorse? Well, a word on digestion. It's the preparing of food for its absorption into the body. But nature has so arranged our digestions that we know not what they're doing. We're kept in blissful ignorance of stomach movements, of gastric juices, of pepsin and renin and all the paraphernalia of digestive ferments. As Mark Twain put it, part of the secret of success in this life is to eat what you like and let the food fight it out inside.
As the war progressed, the rationing system was refined to accommodate different needs. To create the fairest allocation as possible, the Ministry of Food created classifications based on age and profession. Workers doing heavy labour were entitled to larger rations than, say, office workers. Meanwhile, children received smaller rations, but relatively higher proportions of fats and protein, while nursing and expectant mothers were entitled to additional amounts of milk and other animal-based foodstuffs. Supplementary rations were also given to the sick and to people doing work that was considered to be detrimental to their health. In June 1942, Roosevelt and Churchill jointly established the Combined Food Board to control and allocate, fairly and equally, the combined food resources of the United States and the United Kingdom as a consequence of massive international food shortages. This, though, did not alleviate food shortages in Britain, but perhaps it prevented them from getting worse. By late 1942, British and Canadian convoy escorts, now joined by the Americans, began to win the battle with the U-boats. In the autumn of that year, 60 U-boats were destroyed, but still 10 merchant ships were being sunk for every one U-boat destroyed. This may appear to be a high number, but it was an immense improvement compared to the situation during the previous 2 years. The big difference now was that Germany could not replace their U-boats as fast as they were being sunk, while the American construction of Liberty ships was keeping pace with Allied shipping losses. But despite this improvement, there was now heavy demand on shipping for military operations. Military supplies urgently needed shipping to Egypt and had to be taken around South Africa. The Allied landings in northwest Africa, the liberation of Pacific islands, and later the landings in Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy all consumed vast quantities of shipping. This left little capacity for bringing food to Britain. By 1943, the Americans had started to arrive in Britain in preparation for D-Day. They were somewhat underwhelmed by the BBC's output. General Eisenhower personally brought pressure to bear for an upgrade in the programming. The Forces programme was replaced by the General Forces programme, which featured top-rated programmes like the Bob Hope Show that was heard on British radio for the first time.
The Pepsodent Show, starring Bob Hope.
When you're feeling lonesome, strictly on your lonesome, where there's life, remember there is still Bob Hope.
Thank you so much. How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Bob, middle of the winter Hope, telling you if you've got preserves in the cellar, use Pepsodent and you'll preserve what's under your smeller.
British entertainment and comedy shows flourished, with shows like Bandwagon, Much Binding in the Marsh, The Old Town Hall, and Workers' Playtime.
Ladies and gentlemen, Workers' Playtime! Hello, war workers. Gather round for your own special show, broadcast as usual from a large wartime factory canteen before a crowd of Britain's men and women victory workers. We're calling all workers in this country and in all the Allied nations. Here's to you, and here is your show.
There were entertainment programmes for specific elements of the armed forces. Ak Ak Beer Beer for the anti-aircraft gunners and balloon barrage personnel, and High Gang for servicemen everywhere.
Hi, gang. Welcome to the High Gang Show, coming to you from the heart of London, starring B.B. Daniels, Vic Olive, and Ben Lyon. That's me, folks, with Jay Woburn, his orchestra, Sam Brown, the Green Sisters, and our guest star, whose name we're keeping a secret until later on in the program.
The favourite British entertainment show of the war was I.T.M.A, which stood for It's That Man Again. The title of the show was a reference to a term frequently used before the war when talking about incidents involving Germany, where people would say, "Oh, it's that man again," as a reference to Hitler. The show was a character-driven comedy in which satirical targets included officialdom and the proliferation of minor wartime regulations. Running throughout the war and into the late 1940s, it starred Tommy Handley, a fast-talking figure around whom all other characters revolved.
Here we are with the home fleet, and it's that man again.
Pulsating with perspicacity, perpetuating pusillanimous prevarications, precisely producing paradoxal fit, well, forevermore.
Private boy, Mr. Commandant boy, going to fight to complain. When trouble's brewing, it's misdoing.
Oh, I don't know what's fighting the boss. Ever since he had that invitation to visit the Navy, he's been all at sea.
The day that everyone in Britain had been waiting for arrived on the 6th of June, 1944.
The BBC Home Service. Here is a special bulletin read by John Snagg. D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European fortress. The first official news came just after 9:30, when Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force issued Communique Number 1. This said, under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
But less than a week later, Germany started its attack upon London with the V-1 flying bomb, known to the British as the Doodlebug. 3 months later, the V-2, a rather more potent flying bomb, was deployed, but in effect, this was a last-gasp effort of a defeated Germany. By the end of the year, the Home Guard had been stood down and the blackout replaced by a partial dim-out. During early 1945, flying bomb attacks became less potent as Allied troops pushed further east into Europe. And on the 8th of May, Winston Churchill addressed the nation.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied expeditionary forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command.
Tired, battered and war-torn, the British had survived the greatest military threat of their history. Regulation would now need to be unwound, while rationing would continue for a further 10 years. But at least the population could return to a normal life.